title of our presentation this morning that we use is simply called Give Me Jesus. Give Me Jesus. And the background of this, so far as the title, and as I was jotting these points, these notes down initially, a short time back, rather quickly, is simply this. As I view religious folks, per se, and sometimes it seems like maybe some in the church, I view per se those that are a part of different denominations and all, it seems like that they have developed in their mind a Jesus that is just, how do we say it, just a figment of their imagination. Okay? These folks talk about Jesus, and verbally they express how they love Jesus, and Jesus is this to me, and Jesus is that to me, and all of that. But really a lot of these folks have created, and you'll see what I mean as we progress here, they have created in their own mind their own fictitious Jesus, their own Jesus, you know. And so when they say, give me Jesus, they're saying, give me the Jesus that I have created. The Jesus that, in my own mind, who I think he is, and who I think he stands for, and who I think he, so far as his teachings and what he represents and all. And so I have learned that in my observation of folks and my years in the church, that there's quite a few folks that way. That again, when they say, give me Jesus, they're saying, give me the Jesus that I want, the Jesus that I feel like that, he stands for this and stands for that. And usually it's things that, that's watered down and the Jesus that isn't the Jesus of the Bible. We're going to look at, time permitting, 4 areas, 4 points this morning so far as Jesus. And this is the Jesus that we want. Not the Jesus that some have created and developed in their own mind. Not some fantasy Jesus, not some fictitious Jesus, but the true Jesus of the Bible. Before we get into these 4 points, let's notice this. A lot of folks, like we have just briefly described, they want what I call a buffet-style Christianity. A lot of folks like that involve themselves in what I depict, what I tag as a buffet style. They want a buffet style Christianity. That is, a restaurant. I'm sure that you all have them here in Texas as well as we have in Ohio and likely all over. But you know what a buffet restaurant is. That is a restaurant where you can go in and instead of placing your order, on the menu, there is a section of the restaurant where you can walk around the table and pick and choose what you want. I like restaurants like that because, unfortunately, I'm sort of a finicky eater. And so, I can pick and choose the things that I like. I can go ahead and, if the pizza is over here, I can walk around. Usually the table is a lot longer and so forth and various selections, but I can pick, my pizza. I can skip the green beans, and I can go over and, select the chicken and pick and choose. Pick and choose. And I suppose that's okay when it comes to meals and perhaps other carnal things. But again, there's a lot of folks that have a buffet-style Christianity. They want to pick and choose what they want to do. They want to pick and choose what they want to believe. Metaphorically speaking, as they walk around the table of truth, they'll pick up baptism because that's okay, And the next plate, so to speak, so far as we're talking about members of the church here now for a few moments. The next plate, so to speak, being the Lord's Supper, and that plate teaching, the one cup and so forth. That's good. That's all right. But the third plate may be rather controversial. Perhaps it has to do with the assembly issue. Perhaps it has to do with the hair question. Perhaps it has to do with something else. And so, because that plate is, they don't like that plate. Like, I don't like green beans. They don't like that plate. And so it's easy for them to just skip over it, you see. A lot of folks, especially out there in the world, especially those who claim to be Christians, who are a part of denominations, and sometimes, too often, especially anymore, it seems like, in our day and age, and we're ashamed to say this in the church, it's easy for folks to have a buffet-style Christianity. And that's not what we want. There are things in the Scriptures, as you know, that are easy for me to digest, to discern, to absorb, and we're all fleshly. We're all human beings. And there are things that are challenging. Various passages in Scriptures that we read where we find that we have to change our thinking and change our speech and change our priorities and change our beliefs. And it's not easy. It's not easy for any of us. But we must do that because we do not want to have, one more time, we do not want to have a buffet-style Christianity. Well, back to our message here with that said, so far as give me Jesus. We find that we, whenever we declare that we want Jesus, not some fictitious Jesus, not a Jesus that we have created because we want to have a buffet-style Christianity, but when we say, number one, give me Jesus, we want the Jesus that teaches this, that we must get on, stay on the straight and narrow way. Now, whenever you hear a denominational person say, I love Jesus and give me Jesus, is that the Jesus that they want, really and truly? Likely not. Because we know when Jesus declares, or when Jesus says that we must get on and stay on the straight and narrow way, we know what that means. We know that that means that there are things that we must, change in our life. We know that that means that there are things that at times that we must change and give up, There are sacrifices that we must make. But number one this morning, that's the Jesus that you want, I'm certain. That's the Jesus that we want. Not the Jesus that they want, but the Jesus that we want, that says, number one, that we must get on and stay on the straight and narrow way. Jesus says, the Jesus that we want, when we say, give me Jesus, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 14, this, enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way, which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. I realize this morning that these two passages that you have read in your own Bible reading and studying many, many times. I realize this morning that these two passages, you have heard the preachers and congregational teachers expound on these two verses. They are there. And they are verses that we must live by and abide by. This is the Jesus that we want. The Jesus that says that we must, again, get on and stay on the straight and narrow way. Let's notice a few things here. First, in verse 13, Jesus says again, enter ye in at the strait gates. I'm certain that you have looked at this before and perhaps have been taught by others this as they have went over these verses and defined some things here. But the word straight here, as it's spelled S-T-R-A-I-T, not S-T-R-A-I-G-H-T. The word straight here means challenging, difficult, hard. Notice that. That's the Jesus that we want, that we should want, that they should want. The Jesus that teaches that we must get on and stay on the road that is challenging, difficult, hard. But, and we say this lovingly here this morning, denominational folks don't want that road. They want the road that is easy. They want the path or the road of least resistance. They want to, as you know, they want to be able to just believe and do and dress and say and think even whatever they want to think, and go wherever they want to go. and all. They want the easy life. And we, because we're in the flesh, we have to be cautious because we may want, Satan tempts us. And Satan wants to influence us to take the easy road, the easy path, the easy way. Jesus says, the Jesus that we want says, to enter in at the straits, the challenging, the difficult, the hard way. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be that go in thereat. Because straight, challenging, hard, difficult, because straight is the gate, and narrow is the way. We'll notice that thought here in a few moments. Narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Let's notice a couple of things here in verse 14. Jesus says here that the way is narrow. That means that the way that we want, as we proclaim that we want Jesus, and the Jesus, number one, that teaches that we must get on and stay on the narrow, the straight and narrow way. Secondly, this morning, as we analyze this, the way is narrow. What does that mean? That means the way that we must get on and stay on, that way is limited. Is limited. It is not limited so much to where we shouldn't enjoy being on that way. As a note here, as a thought here rather, there are folks who feel like, and we trust that none of us have this mindset, there are folks who feel like that as they read the Bible, as perhaps they read specifically the New Testament, that there are so many laws and dictates and commandments, and they deduct that, you just can't do this and you can't do that, and they deduct in their own mind, they reason that, why, I guess you just can't do anything. I guess you just can't go anywhere. I guess you can you just can't say maybe anything. And it's not that way. We must realize and understand this morning, and I realize that you know this, but just to remind you here this morning, that, God built us and God designed us. And with that crucial point in mind, again, God built us and God designed us. God knows what's best for us. And that is why, not to be mean, not to be cruel, not so we can look down from heaven and say, I've got those folks, there's just nothing they can do, Their life is so limited in what they can do and all, and I'm doing that to be mean. God isn't that way. But He knows that, He built us and He designed us, and we're in the flesh. He knows what's best for us. That's the point here. He knows what's best for us. And so, for example, as He has given us various thoughts in Galatians chapter 5, there so far as the 17 works of the flesh, His thoughts, His ways, those things that we are not permitted to do, He has told us not to folly in those things and other things as well, because He loves us, He built us, He designed us, and He knows what's best for us. He knows it's not best for us to commit adultery, for example. He knows it's not good for us to commit fornication, for example. He knows it's not good for us to dabble in witchcraft and so forth. He built us, He designed us, He knows what's best for us. And that's the way, folks, we should view all of God's commandments, no matter what it is, on the narrow way, the limited way. There are some folks who are going back to how some folks feel about God's commandments and God's laws and God's dictates. Sadly, there are some folks who feel like that, and again, they have created this thought in their own mind. They feel like there are just so many don'ts and so many commandments. They feel like they're just being choked. And it's sad that folks feel that way. Again, they should have the perspective that God has given us these laws and commandments to assist us and to help us and to better us in this life. He has given us, once again, these laws that us guys who are married can be better husbands and be better fathers. and women can be better wives and mothers, and we can just be better citizens all around, and better Christians, of course. But back to this previous thought, there are those who feel like they're being strangled. They feel like that there's too many don'ts and laws and so forth, and they feel like some declare they feel like they're in some sort of a little square box, you know. And it's sad that folks feel that way, and we trust this morning that none of us have that mindset. None of us feel that way. That we're just in some little box and we can't go anywhere. We can't do anything. We just can't even hardly say anything, and it's not that way. But we do want the Jesus that teaches that we must get on and stay on the straight, the difficult, the hard, the straight, and the limited way. There are several things as members of the church that we cannot follow yet. Why? Because God tells us we can. Why did God tell us that we can? Because He doesn't like us? Because He wants to be cruel to us and mean to us? No. He knows what's best for us. He knows what's best for us. So number one, we want the Jesus who teaches that we must be on the straight and narrow way. Here's another one. Number two this morning. We want the Jesus who teaches that we must put Him first. Notice this one. We must put Him first in all things. Denominational folks and other folks, perhaps, that talk about Jesus. And that's what a lot of it is, just proclamations, just lip service, who talk about Jesus and who say, "Give me Jesus." Likely, they don't want the Jesus. I know they don't. By their fruits and all, they don't want the Jesus that declares that you must put me first in all things. And we know this by their fruits, because these denominational folks that I know and you know and so forth, that are good people and have a lot of excellent attributes, and maybe sometimes in a couple of areas, maybe even outshine us, perhaps. But these folks, when it comes to their priorities, and that's point number two, when it comes to their priorities, so far as their Bible reading, their prayer life, works of benevolence, their church attendance, why? That's not the Jesus they want. That's not the Jesus they want. No, they want some sort of Jesus who just, like the buffet style point we mentioned a while ago. But we want the Jesus who teaches, don't we? Who teaches that we must serve Him first and put Him first in every area, in all things. That's the Jesus that we want this morning. In Matthew chapter 6, we was in Matthew 7 a little bit ago. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24, and then also verses 25 through 34, the majority of the chapter here, we find that Jesus teaches this point. Let's read some verses here for a few moments. Matthew chapter 6, and let's begin there at verse 19. Jesus says, and this is the Jesus that we want, the Jesus that we want teaches here. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, He says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through and steal." And then notice verse 21 closely. Jesus says, "For where your treasure is," He's talking about priorities here. That's point number two. We want the Jesus that teaches us that we must prioritize our lives. And that spiritual things, Jesus, the church, and so forth, they should be number one within our lives. He says here in verse 21, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." That little line, that little verse speaks volumes. It really does. Again, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Skip down to verse 24. Jesus says, "No man can serve two masters." A lot of folks try. They sure do. In fact, the masses, you stop and think about this, the masses of humanity try to serve two masters. The masses, the majority of human beings on this globe try to serve two masters. They, for the most part, they wanted to appease their flesh, but they also want to have a little bit of religion in them, you know. And they tell us, oh, I believe in God, and I believe in Jesus, and, you know, I go to church. You do? Well, yes, I go every Christmas and every Easter, you know. And I know the Bible. You do? Why, yeah, I know John 3:16, you know. And so they have a little bit of religion in them, and so they want to play both parts, so to speak. They want to serve two masters, but that's not us, and that's not the Jesus that we serve. That's not the Jesus that we want, but it is the Jesus that they have created, the religion, the spirituality, and so forth, the life that they have created, and that's how they live, and that's what they want. But back to verse 24. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon. Then notice verse 25 on. Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body, what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meats, and the body than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns. Yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? Which of you by taking the thought can add 1 cubit unto his stature? And why take ye thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they sow, and they toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, verse 30, wherefore if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or whether withal shall we be clothed? For after all these things do the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knoweth, that's the individual, you know, that built us and made us and designed us, that we referred to a little bit ago. For your heavenly Father knoweth that ye need all of these things. But here's the key first verse that we're building up to in point number 2 here this morning. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Seek ye first. Such elementary words. I mean, here in these verses that we just read and highlighting here in verse 33, there's nothing deep. There's nothing that you have to look up, really. You know, there's no Greek words that you have to look up. There's nothing here that pertains to prophecy. It's just elementary language. And yet so many folks, in fact the masses of religious folks, will not abide by this simple verse. They will not. When it comes to seeking him and putting him first in every area. No, these folks are so caught up in life, so caught up in things, so caught up in possessions, and so caught up in various activities. And I've got to watch. And we've got to watch, because once again, we're fleshly, and we're human, and we like to do things, and we like to go places, and we like to just, do a lot of the things the flesh or folly is in doing, you know. But we've got to watch, as members of the church, that we are not so busy, so caught up in things, and doing things, and going here, and going there, and activities and all. We've got to watch that we don't get so caught up in things like the world does that we lose perspective of our true priorities. And we see this so often in our travels, sometimes from place to place. Folks, they say, oh, I love Jesus, and sing, oh, I love Jesus, and give me Jesus. And so we go to a certain area for a gospel meeting, and they're there Sunday morning, and that's it. The service may be Wednesday through Sunday night. They're only there perhaps Sunday morning. But yet they say, give me Jesus. And if someone asked them, well, where were you? Were you sick? No, I wasn't sick, but I had to do this and had to do that, or at least they felt like they had to, and went here and went there and all of this. And the thought here, folks, is just reminding us that Jesus wants first place or no place. Excuse me. And that's it. First place or no place. When it comes to the worship services, and I realize that across our brotherhood that not everyone has a night service or a midweek service and so forth, but so far as our home congregation is concerned, every time the door is open, I should be there. Every time the door is open, we should be there. When my home congregation has a gospel meeting, every service, every time the door is open, I should strive to be there. I realize that sometimes as some things come up to where we can't, I'm not addressing that. I'm just talking about the folks who don't plan ahead and prioritize their life, their spiritual life properly, and yet they say, give me Jesus. Well, they don't want the Jesus that teaches to put him first in every area. Put him first in all things. They really don't want that Jesus. Well, what about us? As we move on now, are we the folks that when we say, give me Jesus, that we are willing to put him first in every area? We put him first in our Bible study and Bible reading. Do we do that? Or are we so caught up with other activities and other things and going here and going there, and we reflect back over a week and we deduct that we've hardly even picked up the book this past week? Is that me? And yet I say, give me Jesus. Are we the kind of folks that, so far as even prayer is concerned, that and sometimes we can get this way. We're so busy with our days. And we're so busy doing this and that, and because we're so busy, we're so tired. So tired. Too tired to pray. Have you ever gone through perhaps a week and look back and, as Paul says, examine yourself, and you deduct and you examine your life and you deduct that, I hardly even prayed this week. I prayed at church, yes, and I prayed before some meals, but I never really myself privately prayed to God because I was too tired, too busy, and all. What a shame. And yet I say, give me Jesus. Do I really want the Jesus that says, put me first in all things? Surely I do, but do I know what that really means? What that really encompasses? What that really entails? Number 3, let's move on. Number 3, we should want the Jesus that says, and notice this one, and this one gets perhaps with some and some families and some places and all, we want the Jesus that says that we must serve him and adore him and love him, even if it means that there are folks, sometimes, some places, some folks in our families that give us grief and all, that we must adore him and love him and serve him. And in doing so, it may create hardships in families. It's so challenging. I've seen that so much in my travels. To me, being an emotional person, it's heartbreaking. I mean, it really is. And after I read some verses, I'll give you a couple of examples where in families where there were folks who stood for truth, young people, 2 instances, who stood for truth. Their parents weren't Christians, and all that was hard. The young people didn't make it. They didn't last in the church. And this third point here is one that is easier said than done, for me anyway, because I was raised up in our brotherhood. I was raised up in the church. And though when my parents were younger, when we were all younger, they weren't as strong in the church as they were in their latter years. But my folks never opposed me, never tried to stop me from just going to church. Never said, Brian, where you're attending is a cult. Never put me down, never belittled me. Never said, I just don't understand this Church of Christ thing, But you'd be surprised at the amount of people in our brotherhood, bless their hearts, that go through that. And sometimes have to encounter that day in and day out. We should pray for them and support them and help them. That's the Jesus that we want. The Jesus that says it just has to be that way, though challenging, though hard. That's the Jesus, number 3, that we want. The Jesus that they want. The Jesus that the world wants. The Jesus that denominational folks want. Or the Jesus that they've created that says, no, let's compromise. Everything doesn't really have to be cut and dried and carved in stone and so forth. But that is not, of course, obviously, the Jesus that we want here today. Staying in the same book now, turn over a few pages in Matthew chapter 10. I realize this morning that we are reading and expounding on all the verses that we're looking at are very elementary and very familiar verses. The verses that we've read so far and the ones that we'll read, we haven't read over any verses where you think, I've never read that before. Or you deduct, I've never heard anyone teach on that before. Or even, I've read that before, but really not very much. These are verses that we've emphasized in the body of Christ over and over and over again. And we should, because these are crucial points and crucial passages that we must cling on to tenaciously. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 through 37, we find that the words of Jesus now become rather challenging on this narrow way, this limited way, on this straight way. Remember, straight, challenging, hard, difficult. And now whenever we bring into this our families, challenging, hard, difficult, stay on the narrow way. This is the Jesus that we're serving. This is the Jesus that we want. This is the Jesus, this is his teachings that we must abide by. Now let's notice what he has to say, number 3, this morning. Verse 32 of Matthew chapter 10. Whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess also before my Father, which is in heaven. But whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father, which is in heaven. Why did I just read those 2 verses? Usually as congregational teachers or preachers, when we emphasize this point, we start at verse 34. But I believe that there is an order here, so to speak. That he's emphasizing here in verses 32 and 33 how that we must be first willing to confess him. And then next he will introduce some things so far as family that's more challenging. So first we find that Jesus teaches us, the Jesus that we want teaches that we must be willing to acknowledge him, willing to confess him, even to all of our families. That's the context here. Even to all of our families. Even if in doing so the going gets rough, we must still be willing to confess truth and confess Jesus and confess him into our families. If I'm not willing to, then again, notice verse 33. But whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father, which is in heaven. 34. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance. Now here's the family introduced here. This is hard. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And then notice verse 36. In the context of this, he's saying here next in verse 32, here's what it may come down to. in some families. A man's foe shall be they of his own household. Now you talk about challenging. You talk about hard. You talk about difficult. Jesus says it may come down to a point to where a man's foes shall be they of his own household. Then he goes on after that and says, he that loveth, in light of what he just said, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not even worthy of me. Now that's where most, if not all, denominational folks, that's where they jump off the boat. Because it's like, that's too hard, Jesus. That's too challenging for me. You know, I love my mom, and I love my dad, and we do too. We do too. We love our families. You know, I come from a very loving family. And, you know, we love our folks. We love our grandparents. We love our families. You know, what we're discussing here in point number 3 is something very hard, something very challenging, but it's a reality that some aren't willing to face because they love their son more than truth. And they love their daughter more than truth. And they love their grandpa more than truth. It happens all the time. And Satan loves it. Satan follies in that. He knows, and we'll go back to our verses here in just a few moments, he knows that amongst us, he knows that there are many things that he can never tempt us in doing that we'll fall for. For example, he knows amongst even us in this room here today, he knows that none of us would never be, no matter how hard the temptation comes by Satan, we would never pollute the Lord's Supper. Never. We would never think to ourselves, you know what, perhaps we should have a couple of cups on the table. We would never entertain that idea. Satan knows that there's a lot of other things that we would never fall for. That we would never say, you know what, let's go ahead and, during the song service, let's go ahead and strum a guitar or play a piano. We'd never fall for that. He realizes that. But he knows that we all have families. And so he thinks, Brian won't fall for that. And Brian won't fall for this or that. But Brian has a family. And you have families. We have families. And he knows that there are many, many families in the church where there are unbelievers. And so how can I get in there? Weave in there, so to speak, and cause a discord? How can I cause the faithful brother to compromise what he believes? The faithful daughter, the faithful son, the faithful grandpa. How can I, through tempting them with this family situation, how can I cause them to weaken, to water down their convictions? How can I eventually cause them to, get off of the narrow, limited way and all? How can I do that? Folks, let me say here, and this is one of the most crucial points that we will look at here in this presentation this morning. Let me say, and please remember this, Satan is certain. Satan works through so many things out there. When we think of Satan, we think of him working through Hollywood and through bad movies and bad music, but Satan works through our families. He sure does. Satan works through our families. So going back to our verses here now, this is what Jesus is reminding us of. And this is the Jesus that we want. The Jesus that says that, yes, you love your mom. And yes, you love your daughter. And yes, you love your son. And yes, you love your aunt, your uncle, and so forth. But you can't love them more than truth. You can't love them more than me. Because if you do, you're not even worthy of me. And that's strong language. And that's coming from the Jesus that we say we want, He says, if I do so, you do so, and the mass of the world, they certainly do so, we're not even worthy of him. Go back to verse 36. And a man's foe shall be they of his own household. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. I've seen in my days in the church a lot of families that have had so many issues in this area. Back when I was a boy, I want to tell you two of them here. Back when I was a boy, there was a young man by the name of Greg Maglio. And we was in, I think, high school. Maybe it was junior high, but it doesn't matter. But I'll just say high school here. And we became close friends. And eventually I baptized young Greg. And nice young boy. And so he started going to services and all, and was doing excellent in church and excellent in the services. In fact, he began to lead some short dismissal prayers, and I believe he began to lead some songs, and I believe he also gave some short little talks. This was back in the early 80s. He was doing fine, doing well. And then family entered in. I didn't know this for a fair measure of time, but his dad was completely opposed. Now think about this. I can't imagine this because, again, I was raised up in the church. But his dad was completely opposed to religion, completely opposed to church, completely opposed to following Christ, completely opposed to it. I mean, 1,000% opposed to it. Greg knew that all the while, and there were some things that he did in his situation that wasn't right, and a couple of things I'll mention here in a few moments to where we would think, well, what would we have done in that situation? One thing that Greg did, here to find out, his dad told him, you cannot go to church. Cannot go. And it came down to, we found out that he stuck out. And he told us a couple of times, and this was back before I was driving, and so he would tell us there toward the end, pick me up down the road. I'll be at a friend of mine's house, and I'm going to stay the night with him on Saturday night. Just pick me up down. He was lying. But the reason why he was saying pick me up at this other place or down the road or whatever from his house was because he had to tell his dad that morning that I'm going to a buddy's house, and lie to him, so that he would not get beat to go to church. His dad a couple of times beat him for going to church. His dad, this is kind of off the main subject here, but just to share with you how bad his dad was. And again, I can't fathom this. His dad told him, you should have nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with Christ, and so forth, and told him, and again, we was in, high school, and I guess we was probably 16, 17, told this young boy, to be a man, Greg, to be a man, you should drink beer. And the point here is, his father advocated and pushed that he should do, what do we say, fleshly things and worldly things. Stay away from Christ. Stay away from the church. Now, with that said, what would I have done in that situation? I don't know anything about that. What would you have done in that situation? Would you still say, would I still say, give me Jesus that teaches that I still have to put him first? And that there will be in situations, sometimes in situations to where there's going to be major conflicts. And maybe so much to where I would be beaten, What would we have done in that kind of situation? Greg, because of his youth, and because he wasn't raised up in the church, of course, he eventually quit the church. And how sad. He was doing so well. Why did he quit church? Because of family. Because of his dad. I said last night there at Mullen, I brought this in, so far as one of my points is concerned, so far as another young gal, and her name was Katie, and soon after we began the new work there in Norton, which then it was, we started in a school building in a little town called Doylestown. But I'll make a long scenario short here. I won't go into how she found us and all. But this young gal by the name of Katie, I think she was like 19 or 20, and she lived in Pennsylvania. Now, you know, we're in Ohio. And again, I won't go into how she found us and all, but she lived in Pennsylvania, and she had to drive for every service, had to drive about an hour and a half. This young girl had to drive about an hour and a half to attend our services. She was baptized and wasn't raised in the church, and her mom, now with Greg it was his dad, but her dad passed away. But her mom, as she began to explain to her mom, I'm going to church. Oh, really? Well, where is it at? It's in Ohio. She's like, what? It's in Ohio? What are you doing? Why are you driving so far? And of course, they had several conversations about just first principle even type of things. You know, the Church of Christ, being the one church and all. And her mom deducted strongly. And I mean strongly. Now, she didn't beat her, but she deducted strongly. Katie, you're going to a cult. You are going to a cult. When they say that you have to drive and attend with them, that's a cult. And she said, her mom said, by the way, why are you going so far? If you want to do this church thing, you know, that's up to you, but why are you driving so far? And Katie had to say to her, well, I drive so far because of how they worship. She's like, what do you mean how they worship? She said, you mean that you can't find within 15, 20 minutes of our house another Church of Christ? I'm sure she could. She didn't know what to say because she knew her mom wouldn't understand this. And she didn't. Well, Mom, I drive to Ohio there. I drive an hour and a half because they use one cup. Can you imagine her mom then thinking, what do you mean? Because they use one cup. You know, this cult has twisted your mind. And just belittled her verbally, big time. I remember on one occasion, she came to services there one Sunday morning, and prior to her leaving the house, her mom had just really belittled her and put her down and said all types of mean and ugly things about what she was doing, and kept emphasizing this cult. By the time Katie got to services, she was just in tears. And she walked in the door, and I remember her there in the corner, and she was crying, and some of the younger sisters approached her and of course said, what's wrong? And of course we knew some of what was taking place with her mom, and saying that we was a cult and everything, but she just couldn't take it anymore. She just burst into tears. I can't fathom that kind of situation where, my mom or my dad would say, what's wrong with you, Brian? Have you lost your mind? You're driving that far to go to church because they have one cup? Now, come on. I raised you better than that. That's not even using common sense. And all those things that parents like that would say. It's so hard for her. Guess what? She left too. She left. She left as well. And there's many other folks like that that I know, and perhaps you know, that just can't take it. They can, if they apply themselves. But younger people, and it's so sad to see younger people who have to oppose their parents spiritually and oppose their parents religiously. So hard. But that's the Jesus that we want. And that's the Jesus that I'm preaching and sharing with you here today. Yes, the Jesus that says, going back to point number 1 and mixing it in here with point number 3, get on and stay on the challenging. You talk about those two scenarios. You talk about something challenging, hard, difficult. Get on the straight and limited way. Katie could have said, well, Mom, maybe you're right, and I don't want to discourage you, And I'd like for you someday to go to church with me as well. So we'll just find, we'll kind of give and take and compromise. And we'll find a Church of Christ around here. And I'm certain the Lord will understand in my situation. And we'll find Digress at Church of Christ, a congregation that has multiple cups. And at least you could have reasoned, at least I'm doing something. At least I'm singing properly. At least there's no woman preaching. At least this and that, and just compromise. And there's so much of that. I'll say this and move on and maybe even close this morning. There are good folks, and we've talked a lot today about folks out there in the world who say, "Give me Jesus," and denominational folks who have created I call a fictitious pretend Jesus, who stands for things that aren't even taught in the Bible. But now in closing this morning, we find that so far as families are concerned, that this creeps into the church, like with Greg and with Katie, and sometimes even amongst some of us in our fellowship and in our brotherhood. In my days in the church, I've also seen this, and I'll close with this thought this morning. I've seen staunch, vibrant, conservative, strong people in the church, parents here, okay? Parents in the church. And they stood for truth on everything. Not just worship, but even points of morality. I mean, they stood for truth on the marriage question. They stood for truth on the assembly. They stood for truth on modesty. They stood for truth on politics. I mean, whatever it is, they stood for truth on. Until Mary started growing up, Sally started growing up, or Johnny started growing up, and perhaps dabbling in these things. And then, it somehow becomes a different situation. I've seen in my days in the church, in my travels, and especially up north there where I'm from, where, for example, parents, both the mom and the dad, strong against divorce and remarriage. I mean, strong against. The dad, in fact, even gave lessons as a congregational teacher, and sometimes would teach against that is, divorce and remarriage. Strong against it. But they had a son or had a daughter. Through time they were married. Unfortunately, the individual that they married turned out to be, just a bad person. Maybe a mean person. Various things. And so a divorce took place. Some more time went by, and their young daughter, their young son, met somebody else. Maybe on the job or whatever, but just a really nice person. And keep in mind now, as Satan, as I said a while ago, Satan enters into our families and enters into these situations to try to cloud our reasoning and cloud our judgment. And so we'll just use Sally here. Sally, who has been divorced now, not by her choice, but, the man that she married found somebody else and was cheating and demanded and won the divorce. And so she's divorced. And 6, 7, 8 years down the road, she meets a fine young man, maybe at work. Just a nice young man, religious and all, and treats her with respect and dignity and everything. And she didn't know that in her marriage. She falls in love. He falls in love. And to make a long situation short, she goes to her folks and says, I've met this man and I'm in love with him and so forth, and we're going to get engaged. And mom and dad are enraged. Well, we've taught you different. We've taught you better. You can't do that. There's no way under the sun you can do that. But through time, the daughter says, well, at least meet the boy. At least let him come over. Okay? Just meet him. And mom and dad's like, okay, have him over one night for supper. And so he comes over. And they fall for him. And they begin to think, later on that night after everyone goes to bed, as they're sitting up in bed talking, they begin to think that, maybe it's not fair and right that our daughter, who is young, 23 years old, 24, 25, 26 years old, maybe it's not fair that she has to be single all of her life. I mean, can you imagine that as a young person? And this, besides that, this boy is such a nice boy. I mean, and it wasn't pretend. He was the real thing. And, her husband did cheat on her, and maybe there is something there in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. Maybe there is an exception. And maybe this, and maybe that. Time goes by, and this has happened more than once, and Brother Chris, and perhaps others have seen this and knows this. Time goes by, and with, sympathy arguments, and with Satan tempting the situation strongly, time goes by, Mom and Dad, they weaken and decide that, yes, go ahead, it can be. We'll back you now. Well, they have to now leave the no exception congregations and go to the exception brotherhood. And that's where they stay, and that's where they worship, and that's how they live. What's my point here? The point going back to the beginning, Mom and Dad, prior to their daughter getting herself in this situation, Mom and Dad was strong against it. But because it was their daughter, it made it different. You see, because it was their daughter or their son, it made it different. And we've got to be cautious about that as parents, because it can happen to me with my kids as easy as it can happen to someone else. And you put yourself in that situation, you stop and think, as going back to this situation where this young Christian gal remarries. She's married to this nice gentleman, boy. And Mom and Dad, I'm sure, think many, many nights, I just can't fathom that my daughter is living in adultery. It's going to lose her soul. There has to be a loophole. There has to be a way that she's okay. I can't fathom that. And that would be hard. We talk about losing as parents a lot of sleep. That would be so hard. And so we try to find loopholes, and we try to find ways to justify this and that and so forth. And again, it can happen to me as easy as it can happen to anyone else. But my final thought here this morning is this. We cannot, as parents, compromise what we believe. We have to always stand for truth, regardless of what our son may someday do. Regardless of what our son may someday, or daughter may someday do. And even turning that around in some situations, like with Greg, and like with Katie, and so many more, regardless of what our parents may choose to do. Or maybe even grandparents. We must always serve the Jesus that says, that teaches, that we must love Him first. And that situation I just introduced to you, which is not a hypothetical situation, it's a situation that happens way too often. Those parents, they ended up loving their daughter more than Jesus. It happens all the time. Hard situation. Bad situation. And perhaps as preachers now, and as congregational teachers, perhaps as a thought here, we need to teach on this point even more. Because I'm finding in the church today, there's more and more situations like this coming up. And we need to emphasize to our flock that we must love Jesus more than our mom, our dad, our son, our daughter, or anyone. Perhaps we need to emphasize this more, so that we don't find situations like I just mentioned with marriage. And even with, one more here, and then I will close. I see this sometimes with the hair question. I trust that you all have studied this and are schooled on this according to 1 Corinthians 11. And I'll close with this example. I've seen in my days in the church moms who stood for truth on this. and because of what was taught there in 1 Corinthians 11, would never trim or cut her God-given glory. Well, she has a daughter. Through time, through years, her daughter grows up, maybe gets around the wrong crowd, maybe in school or wherever, and her daughter begins to trim her hair and cut her hair continuously. And so mom and the daughter, they fuss back and forth, maybe not fuss, but disagree, and so on and so forth, and it becomes an issue and a challenging thing. And so mom eventually says, well, I guess you could be doing worse things. I guess at least you don't drink, and at least she don't have tattoos all over her body, or at least this or that, and begins to justify because she gives in, she gives up, begins to justify, and that's just another situation, an example out of many, many more. Begins to justify that she compromises and gives in to what at one time she strongly believed was wrong to do. But she gave in because of family pressures. Because she, as she reasoned the situation, and as she has deducted these things in 1 Corinthians 11, she couldn't fathom if what she believed was right, that it's wrong to trim or cut. If what she believed was right, then young Sally would lose her soul, and she couldn't fathom that. So because she couldn't fathom that, well, maybe it's not so bad. And here's one situation where some time back we was faced with this in our area, and the same situation happened. And as we had talked to both the mom and the dad about this situation, they said, well, we're currently studying this right now. And wow, is that a cop-out? We're currently looking at this thing right now. And this was, again, in the context of the hair question, because it was in their family. Now with two daughters now. Well, I don't know, we need to look into this more and study this more. Why, they've been in the church for years and years and years. And now they just have to look at this some more? No, it's compromise. It's giving in. And Jesus says, if you're going to do that, you're not even worthy of me. That's our lesson here this morning. At this time, we'll stand together and sing our invitation hymn.